There is a power in belief. A power so profound it can build cathedrals that scrape the heavens and inspire symphonies that echo through eternity. But belief has a shadow, a darker, more volatile side. When it ignites in the hearts of the desperate, when it is fanned by the winds of chaos and whispered by the voices of prophets, it can become a firestorm, a force that sweeps across the land, consuming all in its path, leaving behind only questions and sorrow. Our story tonight is about one such firestorm. It is one of the most haunting and bizarre episodes from the entire medieval period, a chapter of history so strange it feels more like a dark fairy tale than a factual event. It is a story that has baffled historians for centuries, a true medieval mystery that lies at the uncomfortable crossroads of faith, folklore, and tragedy. We're going to journey back to the year 1212 to investigate the enduring, heartbreaking enigma known as the Children's Crusade. To understand the strangeness of 1212, we must first understand the world that birthed it. The early 13th century was not the primitive, ignorant era so often depicted. It was an age of soaring ambition and profound anxiety, a time we often label the Dark Ages, but one that was, in reality, flickering with intense, often dangerous, light. The Great Crusades to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule were in full swing, but the initial fervor had begun to sour. The First Crusade, over a century earlier, had been a shocking success, culminating in the Christian capture of Jerusalem. But since then, the story had been one of disappointment and disillusionment. The most recent effort, the Fourth Crusade, had been a catastrophic failure of ideals. Instead of fighting in the Holy Land, the crusading armies of Europe, diverted by politics and greed, had turned on their fellow Christians and brutally sacked the magnificent city of Constantinople in 1204. The event sent shockwaves through Christendom. If the great knights and nobles of Europe, the appointed defenders of the faith, could be so easily corrupted, so spectacularly miss their holy target, then perhaps the entire enterprise was flawed. A spiritual malaise had set in. There's a growing feeling among the common people that the wealthy and the powerful had failed God. Their sins, their pride, their greed, these were the reasons the Holy Land remained out of reach. Into this climate of spiritual crisis and popular discontent, a new, radical idea began to take hold, whispered in marketplaces and around peasant hearths. Perhaps the sword was not the answer. Perhaps God did not want the Holy Land to be won back by worldly, sinful men in armor. Perhaps he was waiting for a different kind of army. An army of the pure, the innocent, the humble. An army of children. The story that has come down to us through the centuries is fragmented, told by different monastic chroniclers, often decades after the events, their accounts colored by hearsay and their own theological agendas. But when pieced together, they paint a startling picture. They tell of not one, but two distinct movements that erupted almost simultaneously in the spring and summer of 1212, one in France and one in Germany. Our first protagonist is a French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes. Like Joan of Arc 2 centuries later, Stephen claimed to have received a divine vision. He said that Jesus Christ himself had appeared to him, disguised as a poor pilgrim, and had given him a letter. This letter, he claimed, was for the King of France. Stephen began to preach in the villages near his home, his charisma and the sheer conviction of his story drawing crowds. He spoke of a new kind of crusade, one that would triumph not through violence, but through the power of faith alone. He promised that when his army of innocents reached the Mediterranean Sea, God would perform a miracle. The waters would part, just as they had for Moses, and they would walk on dry land all the way to Jerusalem. There, the sheer power of their purity would convert the Saracens to Christianity, and the holy city would be returned to Christendom without a single drop of blood being shed. It was a beautiful, powerful message in a world weary of war. And it spread like wildfire. Children, adolescents, and even some adults were swept up in the fervor. They left their homes, their farms, their apprenticeships to follow the boy prophet. Chroniclers speak of 30,000 followers, a number that is almost certainly an exaggeration, but the scale of the movement was clearly shocking to contemporary observers. They began a long march south, a river of humanity flowing towards Paris to present the divine letter to King Philip II. Along the way, they were met with a mixture of awe and pity. Some people gave them food and shelter, believing they were witnessing a genuine miracle. Others, including the more established clergy, were deeply skeptical, seeing it as a dangerous delusion. When Stephen and his followers finally reached Paris, the king was not impressed. Advised by the scholars at the University of Paris, King Philip ordered the children to disperse and return to their homes. For many, this was the end of the dream. Disillusioned and exhausted, they began the long, hard journey back. But a large, hardcore contingent, still fiercely loyal to Stephen, refused to give up. Their faith was unshaken. The king was just a man. God's plan was supreme. They continued their march south, heading for the port city of Marseille, where they believed the sea was waiting to part for them. They arrived in Marseille, thousands of them, standing on the shores of the Mediterranean, their hearts full of hope, and they waited. They prayed. They sang hymns. And the sea did not move. Day after day, the miracle failed to materialize. Their supplies dwindled. The initial fervor began to curdle into despair. And then, an offer. Two local merchants, who the chroniclers give the sinister, almost cartoonish names of Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, came forward. They said they were moved by the children's piety. They offered to provide 7 ships to take the young crusaders to the Holy Land, free of charge, as an act of Christian charity. It seemed like a prayer answered. The sea had not parted, but God had provided another way. Thousands of the remaining followers eagerly boarded the ships and set sail. What happened next turns the story from one of tragic delusion to one of outright horror. 2 of the 7 ships were wrecked in a storm off the coast of Sardinia, and all aboard were drowned. The remaining 5 ships, however, were not bound for the Holy Land. Hugh the Iron and William the Pig were not philanthropists, they were slave traders. They sailed the ships directly to the coasts of North Africa, to Bougie in modern-day Algeria, and to Alexandria in Egypt. There, the thousands of hopeful, innocent crusaders were sold into slavery in the markets of the Saracens they had set out to convert. The chroniclers tell us that many of them held fast to their Christian faith for the rest of their lives, dying as martyrs in a foreign land. Stephen of Cloyes himself is never heard from again. It is a chilling, horrifying end. A story of innocence betrayed, a testament to the depths of human cruelty. But it is only half of the story of 1212. At the very same time that Stephen was preaching in France, a similar movement was erupting across the Rhine in Germany. Its leader was another charismatic boy, Nicholas of Cologne. His message was strikingly similar to Stephen's. He too preached a crusade of peace. He wore a T-shaped cross, a tau, and gathered a massive following, perhaps as many as 20,000 or more. His stated goal was also to reach the Holy Land, and he too promised that the Mediterranean would part before them. Nicholas's army was a different kind of procession. It was not just children, but a vast collection of the rural poor, men, women, the elderly, entire families who had abandoned their land. They began a grueling journey south, not towards France, but over the Alps, aiming for Italy. The trek across the mountains was an ordeal. They were ill-equipped, with little food and inadequate clothing. The Alpine passes were treacherous. Many died from starvation, exhaustion, and exposure along the way. By the time they descended into the plains of Italy in late August, their numbers had been severely depleted, perhaps by as much as 2/3. The weary survivors split into 2 groups. One, led by Nicholas himself, arrived in the port city of Genoa. And there, just like their French counterparts, they stood before the unmoving sea. The promised miracle failed. The city authorities of Genoa were practical. They saw not a holy army, but a swarm of starving vagrants. They gave them a choice: settle here and become citizens, or leave within a few days. Many, their faith shattered, chose to stay. Nicholas, however, was undeterred. He led his remaining loyal followers onward to the city of Pisa. In Pisa, they were finally given passage to the Holy Land by 2 ships, but their ultimate fate is unknown. They sail out of the historical record into the mists of legend. The other group of German crusaders had a different, but no less tragic, fate. They had marched not to Genoa, but to Rome itself, hoping for the blessing of the most powerful man in Christendom, Pope Innocent III. The Pope was a brilliant, pragmatic, and deeply pious man. He was moved by their devotion but horrified by their naivety. He met with them, praised their zeal, but formally released them from their crusading vows, commanding them to return home. For these pilgrims, their journey ended not in betrayal or disillusionment, but with the gentle but firm hand of authority. The journey home, however, was just as brutal as the journey south. Many more perished on the return trek across the Alps. Some who made it back were mocked and scorned. Others simply disappeared, melting back into the landscape or dying in obscurity. A saying, recorded by a later chronicler, was said to have been common at the time. To the sea, all of us. A grim epitaph for a generation's lost hope. This, then, is the traditional narrative of the Children's Crusade. A shocking tale of religious fanaticism, of innocence exploited, and of faith leading to ruin. It is one of the most memorable and unexplained historical events of the Middle Ages. But is it true? For centuries, this story was largely accepted at face value. But in recent decades, modern historians have begun to look at the sources with a more critical eye, and what they have found suggests a very different story. The truth may be less fantastical, but in its own way, it is even more profound and tragic. The key to unlocking this medieval mystery lies not in the story itself, but in the meaning of a single, crucial Latin word. That word is pueri. The monastic chroniclers who wrote about these events all wrote in Latin, the scholarly language of the day. They described the followers of Stephen and Nicholas as pueri. For centuries, this was translated simply and directly as boys or children. And thus, the legend of a literal children's crusade was born. But modern scholarship, most notably the work of historian Peter Reeds, has shown that in the social context of the 13th century, pueri had a much broader and more nuanced meaning. It did not just refer to chronological age. It was also a term used to describe the rural poor, the landless, the disenfranchised. The paupers Christi, a poor of Christ. It was a social and economic class, not an age group. When you reread the Chronicles with this new understanding, the entire event transforms. This was not a march of 30,000 schoolchildren. It was a massive, unauthorized social and religious procession of the desperate and the poor. These were not children in the modern sense. They were the landless peasants, the day laborers, the beggars, the outcasts, the people at the very bottom of the rigid feudal pyramid. They were people with nothing to lose, who saw in the apocalyptic preaching of charismatic leaders like Stephen and Nicholas a chance for spiritual renewal and, perhaps, a better life. This reinterpretation solves many of the problems with the traditional story. It explains how such a massive group could have organized and traveled so far. It wasn't a school trip, it was a mass migration of the dispossessed. It also recasts the leaders. Stephen and Nicholas were probably not little boys, but young men, perhaps in their late teens or early 20s, who possessed a powerful, zealous charisma that resonated deeply with the anxieties of the poor. And what of the miracles? The promise that the sea would part? In this new context, this too can be understood differently. It was likely not meant as a literal, physical promise. It was a metaphor. It was a belief, common in these popular piety movements, that the faith of the humble and the pure could achieve what the armies and riches of the powerful could not. It was a symbolic statement. God would make a path for his chosen poor. The failure of the sea to part was not just a failed magic trick. It was the brutal collision of metaphorical faith with physical reality. So, what really happened in 1212? The most likely scenario is this. 2 charismatic leaders, Stephen in France and Nicholas in Germany, inspired massive, unauthorized pilgrimages of the rural poor. These were not military crusades. The marchers were unarmed. Their goal was not to fight, but to make a grand, penitential journey to the Holy Land, believing their piety would be a powerful spiritual weapon. They were an embarrassment and a threat to the established order. They represented a form of popular, unregulated religious fanaticism that the church and secular rulers found deeply unsettling. The movements ultimately failed because they had no logistical support and no official sanction. They were dispersed by authorities, as in Paris and Rome, or they simply disintegrated when faced with the harsh realities of geography and starvation, as in Genoa and on the slopes of the Alps. But what about the most horrifying part of the story? The betrayal by the merchants, the selling of thousands of children into slavery in North Africa? Here, the historical consensus is much more skeptical. This part of the story appears only in the later chronicles, written 50 years or more after the events. Most historians now believe it is a later embellishment, a fabrication added to the tale. But why would the chroniclers add such a grim detail? The answer lies in their purpose. The monastic writers were not neutral journalists. They were theologians with a message. The story of the Pueri being sold into slavery served as a powerful cautionary tale. It was a warning against unauthorized pilgrimages and freelance prophets. The message was clear. If you stray from the path guided by the official church, you risk not just failure, but damnation and ruin. It was a way for the clerical establishment to reassert its authority over popular religious movements that it could not control. The story of evil merchants, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, is so perfectly villainous it feels more like a parable than a historical account. So, the Children's Crusade, as we know it, likely never happened. There was no army of innocent toddlers marching off to war. But that does not mean nothing happened. Something very real and very tragic did occur in 1212. It was the Crusade of the Poor. A desperate, hopeful, and ultimately doomed popular movement born out of the social and spiritual anxieties of an age. The story was then taken by later writers, misunderstood, and mythologized into the dark fairy tale that has fascinated and horrified us for 800 years. The question that remains is why? Why has this myth proven so incredibly durable? The answer, I think, is because the image of an army of children marching to their doom is just too powerful to forget. It taps into our most primal fears and our deepest sympathies. It is a perfect allegory for lost innocence, for the dangers of blind faith, and for the way the powerful so often exploit the idealism of the vulnerable. The myth is, in many ways, a more compelling story than the complex, messy truth. The story of the Children's Crusade is a stark reminder of how history is made and remade. It is not a static set of facts, but a narrative that is constantly being interpreted and retold. It shows us how a single mistranslated word can create a legend that lasts for centuries. It demonstrates how the anxieties and agendas of one era can shape how it records the events of its own time, leaving a puzzle for future generations to solve. The true medieval mystery of 1212 is not whether the sea parted. It's about how the desperate march of the forgotten Pour the Puer was transformed into a haunting ghost story about children. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes the most enduring legacies are not left by the events themselves, but by the stories we choose to tell about them. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most perplexing chapters. The story of the Children's Crusade hinges on the interpretation of a single word. What other major historical events do you think might be fundamentally misunderstood because of a simple translation error or a later myth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We are always fascinated to read your perspectives. If you enjoy these deep dives into the strange and forgotten corners of the past, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this story with someone who might also appreciate it. Your support is what allows us to continue our search for these lost narratives. Until our next journey, sleep well. End of script.